Despite the title of this colloquium, I'm not going to talk about grand residences. In fact, in some respects, I'm going to talk about the very opposite. There were some freestanding mansions built in London in the 18th century, but noblemen and women and the gentry, what we call the landed classes, were more likely to live in something looking like this. I'm going to explore some of the reasons for this choice, and in doing so I need to break down some assumptions that have got in the way of a clear line of sight through to choice and reasoning in the consumer behaviour of the 18th century aristocrat in England. The English country house features proudly and prominently in British architectural history. The buildings are impressive and the grounds often more so, and the houses themselves are associated with wider country estates, with established family and with territorial and political power. Even if your family did not have a long connection with the land, it could be made to look as if it did. These were the grandest exhibitions of their time, and they are also credited in the architectural historical literature with meaning. That is, they are allowed to be more than simply buildings or residences, but are taken to be symbols. And many words are spent explaining the abstract qualities of the aristocratic English country house. The English townhouse, even the London townhouse, is much less prominent in the literature. In fact, it's scarcely there at all. Even the grander freestanding mansions, of which few were built, and even fewer were architecturally interesting, are barely covered. This is Devonshire House on Piccadilly from the early 18th century, and it sits behind a wall, so you wouldn't have seen it anyway, and it wasn't really worth looking at. Instead, the townhouse mostly features in narratives about urban growth. That is, as a standard component of urban planning and the speculative development of housing on London's principal estates, such as these houses at Bedford Square on the Duke of Bedford's land in London. The absence of external individuality in rows of these speculative houses is then taken to indicate an absence of significance, both within architectural history and within the lives of their owners. On the face of it, the reasons for this may be simple. The house doesn't look as if it would have much meaning. It isn't grand in size or appearance. It stands directly on the streets, joining hands with its neighbours, and looks remarkably like them. It doesn't come with land, and not even stabling very often. Most houses of this sort were run up by builders rather than architects, and often in a hurry and not always to high standards. And the form didn't develop significantly over time. The Georgian terrace was essentially a developmental dead end. It's not surprising, perhaps, that one of the great historians of British 18th century architecture, John Summerson, wrote that members of the aristocracy were not interested in their townhouses to anything like the same extent that they were in their country dwellings. For the most part, they were content with the standard product of the time, the terrace house. In support of this assertion, Summerson refers to an essay on the buildings and improvements of London, written in 1771, in which the author states that many a nobleman whose proud seat in the country is adorned with all the riches of architecture is here content with a simple dwelling, convenient within and unornamented without. Traditional stories of the townhouse as a utilitarian and hastily constructed London base for the landed classes are therefore very comfortably corroborated by the built evidence and by familiar 18th century sources. They tend to play down the terrace house's great popularity in the period and look neither to the house itself nor to its occupants' relationship with it for an explanation of that popularity. Now, Summerson's statement may be broadly true, but his assumption, which has been repeated by many others without question, has got in the way of a proper exploration of why the aristocracy were content with the standard product and what the townhouse did mean to its owners and occupants in this period. This need not be a matter of all or nothing. Just because it didn't mean as much doesn't mean to say it didn't mean something, or even that it meant as much by a different sort of assessment. Prior to my work, no one had made a serious and extensive use of a wider range of documentary evidence to understand what owners and occupants of townhouses thought about their property, why and how they chose it or built it, paid for it, used it, decorated it, sold it, and so on, and what uses it had for them other than simply accommodation. So I started my research with that question: what did the townhouse mean to its owners and occupiers? Why were they seemingly content with the standard product of the time, rather than looking for something more grand? I focused on the period 1760 to 90, more or less, because it had four things because it's all four things that may indicate new attitudes to the townhouse or to townhouse ownership. There was an exceptional level of building activity, including these houses. Many rows of houses were run up in this period. There was also a wave of rebuildings, refurbishing, renovating of existing building stock from previous building waves. There were new styles of exterior and interior decoration and some exceptional attempts at house planning within this framework. Most importantly, there was public and private, prescriptive, descriptive, and indeed proscriptive comment on all of the above, suggesting that something new and discomforting was going on in this period. And this includes comments about the plainness of row upon row of similar houses and how they demonstrate a lack of ambition and civic duty among landlords, developers, builders, and especially noblemen who should have been ornamenting the city as their counterparts on the continent did. This plainness and sameness also left the nobleman hiding behind an inscrutable front. How were you supposed to determine rank in the English class system when everyone's house looked the same from the outside? Yet difference was also criticised, especially when it took the form of worryingly feminine excess in such fancified facades. This is on the left-hand side, a front at the Adelphi by Robert and James Adam, which, as you can see, is just stuck on a plain building. And the language used to criticise these sorts of fronts is exactly the same sort of language used to criticise figures such as the Pantheon macaroni. There were abundant comments on appearance and substance, weakness, flimsiness, superficiality, and also about the townhouse as an unnecessary luxury which brought financial ruin and misery to its owners. So we have a standard product which is criticised for being a standard product, yet also for sometimes being different and for being a luxury. We might wonder what on earth was going on. To understand what was happening and why in this period, we need to do what architectural historians often don't like doing or don't do so well. We need to step away from the buildings and towards the people. After all, these are domestic properties. If they're not about people, their needs, their budgets, their tastes, their aspirations, then what are they about? We can draw on a wider range of evidence, diaries, letters, financial records, newspapers and other writings, such as civic essays and architectural treatises, to try to access a way of looking and reading that is not easy for us to recreate if we stay within the normal bounds of architectural history. Because on the one hand, we tend to look for similarities, common elements that will help us define or categorise a building type. On the other hand, we tend to look for distinctive or progressive elements, which I say are not very evident in the townhouse. So things that fit or reveal a story over time, the history of an architect or of architecture. But that's a very simplistic way of looking, and it's not the way that the 18th century townhouse owner would have looked. There are many more viewpoints that we've recognised, and only when we try these out can we begin to understand choice and reasoning in the 18th century London house. In order to develop a more accurate picture of what value the house really had to its owners, we need to look at it not just as an aesthetic or even simply a functional object, but as property, commodity, personal possession, and indeed symbol. The London house was generally tall and thin, a form dictated by the speculative estate development, which required optimal use of land. So it has a characteristic verticality and tends to lack symmetry at ground floor level because it's simply too wasteful of space. The result is something quite the opposite of the perfect Palladian width and balance of the country house. While this difference was abhorrent to writers of architectural treatises in the period, who were perennially disappointed in the townhouse, it was clearly just fine for consumers, even for noblemen. I cannot say that there was a positive liking of this aesthetic, but there is certainly no evidence amongst consumers of a dislike. Sometimes architects were involved, but most often not. But we do see in this period a real sense of play with this building type that brings the architect in where he was most often excluded. It's not as if nothing interesting could be done with a narrow house front, as examples across the rest of Europe too readily demonstrated. It's just that it didn't happen much in London. Robert and James Adam, leading architects of the time, in particular exploited the constraints of this building type to show what could be done with a standard functional product, both inside and out, that allowed it to move from building to architecture and allowed them to show off. They wrote in regard to this house, 20 St James's Square for Sir Watkin Williams Wynne from the mid-1770s, that there wasn't much an architect could do to display his talents in a front of 46 feet, and then they proceeded to demonstrate that, of course, there was. Builders generally only build what they believe will be sold, and the fact that so many houses of this type were built in this period suggests that it did have a functional purpose for large numbers of landowners. Its principal function, of course, was accommodation. People typically came from the country or from other cities to London for the season, the period from around October to April, when everything happened in the city to coincide with the sitting of Parliament. So people visited for Parliament, for business, to consult professionals, to buy and sell property, to shop, to fix engagements and marriages, to look for wives and husbands, to have babies, and for socialising and entertainment. Before this period, they would more likely have taken temporary lodgings when they needed to be in London, but now there was a trend towards townhouse ownership, or just the lease of a whole house for the season. Again, contemporary and modern-day writers talk of landowners being in London only for the season, as if it were a short period, whereas diaries and household records make clear that many noblemen were in London for far longer periods than they ever spent in their country homes. In any case, the nobility wasn't a single category but a fragmented one, including the brothers, younger sons and widows of noblemen, all with different reasons for being in town. While accommodation was the primary function of the townhouse, when we look at letters from the period, it becomes clear that a good house and the entertainment that it allowed was part of another more abstract function of making what was called a proper figure in London. And the letters reveal it could win you forgiveness for social offences, from adultery to going to the opera without powder. The acquisition of a townhouse often indicated a change in an individual's fortune or status, with the coming of age, inheritance, a seat in the Commons, marriage, separation, divorce or widowhood. And purchases may often have been intended as public statements in this respect, as much as from practical necessity. For example, so Rowland Wynne acquired and remodelled a house in St James's Square in the 1760s when he succeeded to his family estate in the north of England. His wife's marriage settlement helped pay for it. Lord Ilchester bought a house in Grosvenor Square shortly after inheriting his title in the 1770s. And the family's townhouse was bequeathed to his mother, so he could not take that along with the title. The prevalence of bequests of townhouses to widows in this period no doubt led to many more new purchases or leases by other family members in this way. The Duke of Grafton marked his separation with a move to Grosvenor Square and his divorce with a move away again. An important characteristic of these properties is that they were mostly leasehold and therefore necessarily treated differently than the freehold country estate, which was kept in the family line, passing from father to son, protected by entailments and rarely sold. Notwithstanding this, a study of wills and settlements of the period shows some of the landed classes going to great efforts to keep a leasehold townhouse in the family, suggesting that it had an importance beyond anything that Somerson had allowed. The townhouse was generally unencumbered legally, and therefore it was easily bought and sold by the individual owner with no regards to family interests. In this respect, had more in common with movable properties than with the established country house and estate. It was a commodity which could be acquired and disposed of at will. So there was a lively market in the sale and rental of townhouses. Even at the time, it was difficult to know whether it was cheaper to rent a house or to buy one, but either way, it was a much more expensive venture than taking a few rooms at a time. Although there was plentiful supply, house hunters were often very particular, and the smaller their budget and the more picky they were, the harder it might be to find a house to suit. Where we're inclined, in our retrospective view, to note sameness, they noted difference. And the press mocked this excessive discrimination applied to house hunting, which is also evident from the letters and journals of architects who wrote of days spent walking looking for houses suitable for their wealthy patrons. What we see, therefore, is neither the commissioning of new, large and bespoke architect-designed houses, nor a careless attitude towards accommodation in London, but a great deal of attention being paid to the matter of purchasing or renting the standard functional product, the terrace house. Because the aristocratic family was likely to be dispersed, the townhouses were associated with an individual and with each successive owner, rather than the family. And people were casually and repeatedly linked with their townhouse address in private and public reports of comings and goings from London. There was also a good deal of interest in refurbishments and decorative work, sometimes reported in the newspapers, again strengthening the link between person and house. Work on a townhouse was sometimes prioritised over work on the country house. So again, this is 20 St James's Square for Sir Watkin Williams' Wynn by the Adams. He had got them to design for a refurbishment of his country seat, but he spent so much money on this, £40,000 in 18th century terms, so millions, and therefore couldn't do his country estate because he was brought almost to the point of bankruptcy by this work. The standard building type that arose from estate development was ideally suited to this sort of successive and speedy change by sequential owners. It was easy to keep abreast of fashion and show that you had, and owners held entertainments specifically to launch their new interiors, mostly saving the best for inside and a private invited audience. This is Derby House in Grosvenor Square, remodelled again by the Adams, and shows a very plain facade and an extraordinary elaborate interior. Not everyone went to the same, sorry, that's more images of the Derby House interior. Not everyone went to the same lengths as Lord Derby. Elsewhere in the same square, the Duke of Dorset just had a few fireplaces and ceilings done. But it was all expense, and sometimes truly immense figures were spent on refurbishing townhouses. For these many reasons, the townhouse, and particularly its interior, reflected or was taken to reflect an individual in the way that a country house was less likely to. Aside from non-physical qualities such as location, the interior was the only indicator of its proprietor's wealth, taste, character and standing. Horace Walpole, never one to spare a harsh word, made a close link between Lord Derby and his house's decoration, describing it as filigrade into puerility, which was an apt comment on the ill-judged extravagances of a young lord. For Walpole, an excess of fineness was a sign of uncouthness, and too much good taste reveals bad taste. Here we begin to get close to the idea of the townhouse as symbol or sign, even though very differently so than the country house. Country houses may have been open to respectable visitors when the family was not in residence, but nothing compares to the public scrutiny to which the nobleman's townhouse was subjected. This was scrutiny not only of location, appearance and taste, but also of purchase, expenditure and sale. The townhouse in a good location, nicely presented, not only often relied on credit, but was also the means of acquiring it. Leading a fashionable life in the West End got you the credit you needed to lead a fashionable life in the West End. Of course, this was a precarious business to be in, and evidence from the period reveals that many greater and lesser members of the landed classes were prepared to incur excessive debts and suffer the consequences of overspending on even a relatively modest home in London. For many, those consequences included the sacrifice of the house's contents or even the house itself. Again, we get a glimpse of this not necessarily from anything the house tells us, but from accounts, letters, diaries and newspapers. The typical means of selling these houses by auction itself gives an insight into quick changes of fortune and the need to realise the capital tied up in a house in a hurry. Because the house was leasehold and associated with an individual rather than a family, it was both easier for the owner to dispose of than freehold property and easier for creditors to target. Disposability also meant vulnerability, and not all auctions were for the benefit of the house owner. Many were for the benefit of creditors. These auctions and the sales held in the houses themselves were among London's many entertainments with entry by ticket, and the ultimate public scrutiny to which a townhouse and its contents could be subjected, and over which the owner had least control of his or her audience. There is plentiful evidence that not just the purchase but also the disposal of a townhouse was read as an indicator, on the one hand of wealth, ambition or good fortune, on the other of debt, failure or bad luck. And it's no surprise that people went to great lengths to disguise the reasons for selling their London houses, or sometimes chose not to sell because they didn't want people to draw the wrong conclusions, or potentially the right conclusions. We might guess then that a grand failure in a well-furnished and tasteful house in a good location was the next best thing to a grand success in the same surroundings. In 1778, it was reported that Lord Derby had suffered 4 executions, as they were called, in this house. which had been so handsomely refurbished just a few years earlier, with creditors seizing goods in lieu of outstanding debts. Derby's example is extreme, both in its architectural and decorative nature and in the level of expenditure. But what it has in common with other lesser houses is its contribution not only to its owner's public identity in London, but also to his financial distress. That is, the house didn't need to look as if it was luxurious to be a luxury. Houses grand and plain shared a common story of over-expenditure. Luxury might be an appropriate framework for studying what people said about what others were doing, but when looking at what people themselves did and why, it is safer to assume they were driven by concepts of necessity. And as I've said, the house served multiple functions, some practical and more abstract, but all valued by those who chose to spend their money on a house in town. We also need to recognise that the townhouse was caught up in the general 18th century rhetoric about the debilitating evils of London. So you go to London, you return to the country looking like that. And that is a good analogy of country house and townhouse, I think. But surely expenditure wasn't something that happened when you found yourself in London. It was why you went there in the first place. And part of the incentive to come to the city and buy a house there was the chance to make a different sort of display than was possible in the country house. And I would argue that that difference was important. The townhouse was a counterpart, but also a welcome contrast to the country house. And in some respects, the standard product dictated or facilitated these differences rather than simply responding to them. The townhouse was designed for the most efficient use of space, with the successful integration of all elements of the house into one narrow, self-contained site. The cost of building or purchasing and furnishing or running a big house must have been one reason for choosing a smaller one, but there also seems to have been a partiality for compactness, which is evident in the phrasing of house advertisements and in anecdote. Living in a terrace house perhaps constituted real city life. The art of London living was to make a virtue of necessity. Less was possible in the townhouse, and therefore less was expected, even of a nobleman, so that the relatively modest town property brought a kind of freedom, and owners joked about the restrictions of entertaining in a small circuit of small rooms into which was stuffed a crowd that people wanted to be part of. The townhouse also, as I said, had to be readily disposable, and it was easy to sell if it conformed to a norm. Any differentiation, if desired, came later with works done on the interior, but clients and architects seemed to have realised that they could achieve a greater impact by excelling within the same standard framework than by operating within a different one. So the more or less standard townhouse, built in abundance in this period, was a default product with which most people, even aristocrats looking for a house in town, were happy. The abandonment of a scheme for individually detached palaces in Portland Place suggests that even aristocrats did not want such big homes and cared little about distinguishing themselves by the size of their property. There were exceptions, but these were few and far between. In fact, so few that a better question might be, why did some people want freestanding mansions when the trend was towards the terrace house? Who wanted to be shut away behind a wall when the purpose of being in London was to see and be seen, to know and be known? And these ambitions were best served by a terrace house in a fashionable square, cheek by cheek with other aristocratic and lesser residents, stylish or otherwise. I hope that I have argued sufficiently well, even in this short time, against the idea that townhouses meant little to their owners and occupants. As I have said, the townhouse in 18th century London has too often been taken at face value. But if we set aside assumptions and don't judge by appearances, if we temper our architectural historical tendencies and take a wider perspective on practices and preferences, if we simply let in some other evidence and allow the 18th century to speak for itself, basically, if we look without prejudice, we find a fascinating story which tells us more about the townhouse in Georgian London and about its aristocratic occupants than it could ever have told us itself.